Welcome to GGG Insights, connecting you with your community. I am Stephen Schwartz, a director of the East Hampton Group for Good Government, known as the GGG, which brings you this series. The GGG is a nonpartisan citizens group dedicated to educating our residents on issues affecting the town of East Hampton, its villages, and its schools. We encourage civil debate with respect for those with differing opinions. This first series of shows connects you with the issues surrounding November's referendum extending the Community Preservation Fund, the CPF, up to the year 2050, a 20-year extension, and permitting up to 20% of the CPF's revenues to be used for clean water projects. Our first show in this series connected you with the history of the CPF, its operations, and its accomplishments. The second show connected you with the range of water problems East Hampton is facing. And the third show connected you with the proposed water quality improvement plan. Today's program will feature Paul Giardina, an East Hampton resident who until September 30th held management positions with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Paul has raised questions with the town board concerning whether the 20% set-aside is needed and the way it is to be implemented. Our moderator is Arthur Malman, chairman of the GGG, who has served on the town's Budget and Financial Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Stephen, and I want to welcome Paul. Stephen gave you some background about Paul, but I think he was a little short. This is the first time we've had a nuclear engineer as a guest with who used to have at least top secret clearance for federal matters. On the other hand, Paul is not a one-dimensional character. He also raises thoroughbred horses and, I'm told, had a major position at the Springs grocery store. You want to tell us about that grocery store experience, Paul, first? That's general store. I'm sorry, but that's the most important factor here.
Well, from 1983 to 1986, I operated the Springs General Store, which is actually the oldest general store in New York State. And it had laid fallow for about a year, and we brought it back to life for that 3-year period.
And your position was very important, right? What did you do, Paul?
Well, at times I sliced ham.
Okay.
And put together the funding to make it work, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Now, in your other life, though, you had significant positions with the EPA. Would you just tell us a little bit about that background very quickly?
Well, I've worked with the EPA, certainly in areas of radiation protection. But in the environmental scheme of things, all of the responsibilities that EPA deals with always involve the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Superfund, Public Health Service Act. So in dealing with management positions for, say, 40 of the 37 or 38 of the 41 and a half years, I became pretty familiar with the Clean Water Act and its requirements, certainly the Clean Air Act, et cetera, not to mention the Atomic Energy Act. So I've been around and had my fingers, unfortunately and fortunately, in all of the major environmental statutes.
Now, you left the EPA, I think, very recently, September 30th to be exact, if I recall correctly. Now, you're doing consulting, but are you consulting for any towns or villages? Or?
No, specifically, we haven't chosen to do that. And there's a number of reasons, and in one case, I think just to avoid any conflict of interest between a local town that I might live in and situations like that. Now, we don't do that.
Okay. Now, I understand a couple of weeks ago, you made a presentation to the town board about some of your concerns about this referendum and the funding source being 20% of otherwise sacrosanct CPF funds, which, by the way, in a normal year means that possibly the town from the CPF fund could take out between $3 to $4 to $5 million for water projects. The exact amount would depend on how much comes into the CPF. Could you tell us some of your concerns and why we should be wary of what seems to be a rush to get this referendum approved?
Okay. But first, let me start with saying that nothing I want to say today should make anybody feel that I don't believe that there are water quality issues in East Hampton that need to be solved. And after 41 years in working with the EPA, I don't want to give that impression. That is certainly the case. Second of all, I don't want to give the impression that the CPF is, other than a very excellent tool. The problem with the 20% is, as you say, depending upon which year you look at for data, it's between $2 even and $5 million. There exists a funding source that's billions of dollars that's available to the town of East Hampton through the county and through the state. It is the state revolving fund. It's put together by the the Clean Water Act.
But could you just, for those of us who are not familiar with it, we have a little chart today that may start from the beginning, and maybe you can help us walk through it. What you're really talking about is federal sources of funds that may be available for these kinds of projects and how they go down into the town level.
Okay, very simply. If it's a drinking water project or if it's a wastewater project, it's eligible either under the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act. Then the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation, EFC, has the charter to procure those monies, to use those monies when the town submits plans and proposals.
Okay, now let me just stop you right there. So there's this thing called the EFC, this is the State Environmental Facilities Corporation, and it gets money from the federal government probably every year in differing amounts. About how much in total gets to New York State? Because we have 50 states, so I'm not trying to be exact, but if you have a big number at the federal level, it's going to be divided into 50 little pots.
Right, and to give you an idea, Governor Cuomo just for environmental projects around the Tappan Zee Bridge was looking at numbers between $200 million and $1 billion. Now,
from federal sources.
From federal sources. I mean, this is billions of dollars available.
I just don't want to get mixed up here.
But wait a minute, let me just say, it's a revolving fund. So the money gets paid back. The money is given for projects. The projects are done, and over the life of the project, a low-interest loan is granted, unless there are certain cases where actual old-fashioned grants.
Okay, but I guess that's not the usual. The usual, I think, is loans from the EFC to well, let's just go back. I'm sorry for interrupting you. So this Environmental Facilities Corporation gets money from the federal government, millions of dollars a year, certainly. Billions. I'm sorry.
Let's get the numbers right. Okay. I mean, you know, let's get back to the old Everett Dirksen thing. Yeah. $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Now you're talking real money.
Okay. Now you.
$1 to $5 million for the town's problems isn't real money.
Okay. So
that's really the issue we want to focus on.
Okay. So the state gets from the EPA, from the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, billions of dollars a year. A couple of billion, I imagine, at least. Now, so that goes into this pot called the Environmental Facilities Corporation, and then the Facilities Corporation just passes it on to the states, to the local counties and towns and villages, or does it also issue its own bonds?
It can issue its own bonds because it is a private, public corporation. Oh. So it can issue its own. So the funding mechanism isn't very difficult to understand. Towns or sewer districts or whatever propose projects. They've done the engineering work or they're going to do the engineering work, and they propose a project. The EFC rates it, gives it a priority ranking, makes a cutoff line, and gets funding from the Safe Drinking Water and the Clean Water Act.
Okay, so say I'm the town of East Hampton, right, and I get a project that's approved. So I get money from the EFC, a couple $1 million, we'll just say. And
a couple $100,000 if it's a small one.
A couple $100,000. Well, okay. I hope big. So anyway, we get a couple $1 million. I gather we've got to pay it back. we, the town of East Hampton, over a long period of time. I think you mentioned 20, 25, maybe even 30 years. But so really then, any money we get, and I know you mentioned there's a possibility of grants, but they're not too frequent. So any money we get is still an obligation of the town of East Hampton to pay back to the EFC, which then replenishes its own revolving fund for more grants in future years.
It's an obligation of state government.
Yeah. So why does it make a difference whether the town essentially borrows money from the EFC at a reasonable interest rate and has to pay it back, or if the town just goes to the public market and borrows money? But we had some problems several years ago, but now the town's credit rating is pretty good, and the town has actually been reducing its amount of outstanding debt. I know there are people who don't want to see the town borrow a lot of money and start increasing it unproductively, but the town still has the ability to borrow money. Why should it use the New York State EFC, the Environmental Facilities Corporation, as a lender when the town can access other lenders?
Because the amount available is larger, the borrowing can be bigger. The projects we're talking about that ultimately will solve the water quality issues aren't $5 million a year.
No.
They're larger.
Yeah.
And low interest rates that are guaranteed by the state insulate the town to some degree, one would think. Mm-hmm. So the real issue is, one of the debates that really has bothered me is we have people saying that Fred Thiel has said, the federal government has left the playing field with billions of dollars in the state revolving fund. I doubt that that's a fair statement. It's certainly a misinformed statement. What bothers me, and what has continued to bother me about that, and I just checked this yesterday, how often and what has the town done to actually go and tap this money? And I was really chagrined to learn that the town of East Hampton over the last 3 years has approached the EFC for exactly 0 projects. So in other words, they're asking for $5 million a year, essentially, out of a fund that is very, very productive at protecting water quality by taking land out of circulation and not making it subject. They're doing this instead of going to a funding body. It seems to me that if Fred Thiel thinks that the town is, rather the federal government is off the playing field, I don't think the town's even found the locker room here.
Okay, but let's go back to this program, because I'm going to forget the federal level, because I assume you're correct that billions of dollars come from the federal government to the state. So let's focus on this thing called the Environmental Facilities Corporation. And what you said is towns, villages, sewer districts make proposals on a regular basis for funding to the, for loans most of the time, to the EFC. And what has been told to me, and I may be wrong, is there are several ways in which the EFC, the state agency, rates projects. One, is it a major infrastructure project, a sewage treatment plant or something like that, a big infrastructure project like, for example, Bergen Point or Riverhead sewage treatment plant, or the water tunnels to New York City or Buffalo. The next way they rate them, I was told, was, is this remediation where there's a major problem and we're trying to clean up, happily not a nuclear leak, but
that's a completely different fund.
That's a different fund, right? But perhaps a chemical leak or something like that into our drinking water, God forbid, or the bays and estuaries, versus a preservation. We want to keep things as they are, and as it was explained to me, and this is like the third or fourth party hearsay. Remediation is a little bit easier because if you find chromium in the water on day one and you spend $5 million, a year later you should find less chromium. Preservation, a little bit harder to measure. And then the last criteria, and maybe there are more, but I just, have focused on a few of them, is other sources of funding. And I think one of your concerns is that if we tell the EFC we have another source of funding, 20% of the CPF, that won't help us get money. In fact, it may hinder us. But the problem there is we have this great big assortment in the East Hampton Water Quality Improvement Plan, assortment of projects. And the easiest to understand for most people is changing individual septic systems. And there are probably 20,000 of those. And if you went to a really great nitrogen reduction system, it might be today $30,000 a home. I know the people, Jerry Samuelson at our prior, one of our prior shows indicated 10-10 is a goal. Right now our septic system normally produces 50 to 100 milligrams of nitrogen. By the time it goes through the groundwater, it's down to 25 to 50. And the goal is to get that down at the source, the septic system, down to 10, getting into the bays and estuaries at 5, and costing $10,000 or less. Now we're at 30,000. They're hoping to find, which doesn't exist yet as far as I know, a system to upgrade these things. But using the big number, 20,000 systems at 30,000 a system is $600 million over a couple of decades here. Even using the small number of 10,000, the goal, it's $200 million. So our $5 million CPF contribution, I don't want to use this because it sounds bad, because it's a drop in the bucket of water quality here.
Exactly, exactly.
And we really can't do much with that compared to the state funds, which if we can access them, could be really helpful.
That's exactly right. And the most important thing that the town ought to be focusing on, and the traditional way one deals with environmental problems like that, is to have specific projects that are available with engineering reports and that can move forward. Insofar as prioritizing the 8 watersheds, determining which are the septic issues that are the real problem. And I want to point out that there is also other sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. Take a look at your fall bag of fertilizer, which is 25% nitrogen and 5% phosphorus. I don't want to minimize septic, but you know what? Since 1995, every building permit that required a Suffolk County stamp for the septic system. So it ought to be fairly easy to go back and take a look at the pre-1995 septic systems for the 20,000 systems and start prioritizing them, lumping them together for watersheds. Pick the watershed that's number 1, the watershed that's number 2, and organizing projects. This is what needs to be done before you ask people for money. This is the traditional way we do environmental protection. And this is what the town is missing. What bothers me the most is I've looked at the town's reports, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. They haven't ever been reviewed by the town engineer. There's one professional engineer in the town of East Hampton, and they haven't been reviewing this. What we need is the basic engineering from somebody who's on our side as a town resident saying, yes, these are the septic tanks that have been found to fail. And that's not hard to do.
Okay, but I guess part of the problem is, since we've never kept the data, there's no easy database to go to find whether Arthur Malman has a septic system that's working, or he has a cesspool because it's an older house, or quite frankly, he has nothing because it's a very old house. I mean, how do we even start without having an army go out and try to look at these things?
Well, we make databases these days, and a Suffolk County database working with the town of East Hampton should be pretty easy to put together. And anybody who has a pump out in their septic system can be flagged as one septic tank that might, cesspool or septic tank, that might need to be inspected while it's done. In other words, instead of paying a $500 or $600 pump out fee, add another $100 and find out, is it working correctly? Put this in a database. How about requiring every septic system that predates the 1995 building permit situation to be inspected in the next 3 years? That would give you a database that tells you where you prioritize, and it would do it by watershed.
Now, I don't think you're suggesting that the town of East Hampton hire 7 or 8 people or 10 people on a permanent basis to go out and inspect these. I think from discussions we've had before, maybe the way to do this is to use the existing cesspool companies that do pump outs and installations and have them go out and inspect and report back to the town.
That's certainly probably the most cost-effective approach. The building department, remember, the New York State Health Code does not delegate any of these health code responsibilities to the town. Therefore, the building department, quite properly, does not do septic tank inspections. They look for a certification, a stamp, as it were, from the Suffolk County Health Department that 1995 and sooner have been properly done. So, yes, use the industry itself to do the work. Set up a database, and there is your priorities. There's an interesting point here. If this is done first, then you can really come back to the public and say, we want to target Georgica, or we want to target Accabonac Harbor, because we know that there are 6,000 systems, 1,100 are no good, or 2 don't have any systems, and that's where we want to start. Because what's going to happen if one of the problems you always run into with establishing priorities and using local funds is somebody's going to say, wait a minute, you're not doing my watershed now. And that's why the towns avoid doing it before they're asking for $5 million. Because if people really knew what their priorities were, that might question whether they would vote, how they would vote on this. And I think this is an important thing. The voters need to understand what the real constraints are out there. And before anybody starts talking about spending money, what are the systems that need to be improved? We don't know.
See, I'm under the impression that the town has taken the position that conceptually every system fails, not because it doesn't operate according to the Suffolk County Health Department criteria, but rather because it doesn't remove significant amounts of nitrogen and phosphate from the effluent from the house. And it doesn't do that because it's not required. So the 20,000 existing systems under that criteria, since they were never designed to remove nitrogen and phosphate in significant amounts, all are failures. So now we have, so what you're suggesting is something different. Let's not concentrate on 20,000, which is $600 million to fix, or $100 million to fix. Let's figure out which are the worst actors.
Let's prioritize.
Let's prioritize.
Let's make meaningful improvements in water quality, because the one that's next to Georgica Pond, by logic, is more likely to have an impact than one that is, say, halfway up 3 Mile Harbor Road and nowhere near a watershed. So by creating a database and over a 3-year period, assuring that you're going to get a reading on every septic tank, using that you can measure how close they are and prioritize. Because you're right, there is no way a $600 million project to remove every septic tank in the town of East Hampton is logistically possible at this point, whether you use $5 million or you get all $600 million. The infrastructure to manage these kinds of construction projects is enormous. So let's focus on the ones, and let's focus on the ones that are the real issues, and let's also understand what the other contributors are. You know, the surface pollution from our bags of fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, you don't want my wife to have a beautiful green lawn?
My wife wants me to have a beautiful green lawn too.
That's because you raise horses. You've got to have these rolling hills and lawns. But I mean,
you don't need a lot of fertilizer on a horse farm.
Okay, oh, that's true. I forgot. But let's go back to one point you make, because I think it's very important to understand. and maybe there has been discussion, but I haven't really heard it personally. We're now going to, whether we use federal, state money, local money, embark on a major implementation plan that's going to go on for decades, and it's going to cost many millions of dollars. And what you're hitting on is that we only have one engineer in the town, and he's not focused on water. So to some degree, I know the town is very solicitous under the prior administration and the current one of not increasing the head count of town employees, but it almost sounds like we've got to bite the bullet, and if we're going to embark on this major project over the next several decades, we've also got to have people in-house, an engineer or two, or other skill sets in the house to make sure that the people outside the house, outside the town, don't waste our money.
Let me respond.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
you're right.
Okay.
And reprogramming 3 or 4 of the almost 600 positions in town government so that you have more than one town engineer. And we have a perfectly good town engineer who spends most of his time doing work on roads because, let's face it, that's a priority. I mean, keeping the roads going, keeping issues with regard to water pollution control are important issues. These are some of the priority issues. So why don't we spend the money on engineers and scientists that way? That's not what we're doing here.
Okay. So I guess your concern is that before we even have the referendum, you would like to see the town understand and access more fully federal and state monies, which may make the CPF set aside of 20% not that important at the moment, and also increase its staff, and finally to set this up so that people understand which projects are priorities and how that affects the individual homeowner. Having said that, I am being very unjust to you by saying thank you because our time is up and hope you come back.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, really.